Good evening, viewers. Welcome back to my channel, Literati. Today I am going to post my second lecture on Sylvia Plath on a different poem, which is different in many ways. It is a total contrast to the poem which I had discussed before, that is Daddy. The name of this poem, which I am going to analyze today, is The Beekeeper's Daughter. It is a part of a first collection, The Colossus and Other Poems, which was published in 1960 and which contains around 40 poems. The Beekeeper's Daughter shows the poet in a totally different light, in a totally different mood. One of the reasons that it is a total contrast to the poem Daddy, which is full of a deep existential angst, where the poet tries to analyze her own feelings, her own attitude, and come to a conclusion about her father. She needs to demolish the image she has and to find a meaning about her own feelings, her own attitude, and the reality about her father. Daddy expresses the demons in the mind of the poet Sylvia Plath. As I've discussed before, or we have seen the time frame or the background of that poem, it was written in the winter of 1962 and the early 1963, when Sylvia Plath was in a very difficult situation of her life, living alone in London, estranged from her husband, with two small children, suffering from ill health, financial problems. It was also one of the most fertile period of her life. It seems as if she wrote to get away from her problems and the feelings which she had kept in her heart or in her thoughts all these years are expressed in a very subjective manner in all the poems, and particularly Daddy is an expression of a very deeply disturbed mind. We have discussed Daddy in detail in the lecture which I had uploaded and which marked the 60th year of the exact date on which she had committed suicide, that was 11th February 1963. Today I will discuss The Beekeeper's Daughter and see Sylvia Plath in a totally different mood. And after we have analyzed this poem, after we have read this poem, we will go back to see what made Sylvia Plath who she was. Dead by 30, the fact that she had attempted suicide when she was 20, just a student. Also the fact that she was a very highly strung individual, maybe like all poets. She suffered from chronic depression and a bipolar disorder. All these mental maladies combined to make her emotional conflicts and her sense of loneliness and alienation very acute, and which led her to attempt suicide at the age of 20. And in spite of that very catastrophic moment in her life, in spite of the crisis she faced at that juncture when she was just a girl of 20, she survived, and then she went on to win many more honors because she was a child prodigy, and she graduated from one of the most prestigious colleges, Smith College in Massachusetts. She went to Cambridge on the Fulbright scholarship. She met Ted Hughes. They married, they had two children, but the marriage was not a very happy one. And it seems that Sylvia Plath had this deep feeling or deep conflict and an existential angst which was directed towards her parents, particularly her father, because she blames him for dying very early when she was just a girl of 8, before she got a chance to know him, to understand her own feelings towards him. And she was not on very compatible terms with her mother as well. And later on, her marriage to Ted Hughes also was not successful. And being a disturbed individual already, these experiences of life did not make things easier for her. And finally, the demons in her mind led her to commit suicide on 11th February 1963 in a very violent manner. She thrust her head in the gas oven even when her 2 small children were sleeping in the other room. Now, let us look at the beekeeper's daughter today and see what makes us so different. Perhaps it is the time in which she was written, in which she wrote this poem. It is a part of the Colossus and other poems published in 1960, which contains 40 poems. She married Ted Hughes in 1956. When she wrote this poem, or when she must have written this poem, she was experiencing love, motherhood. She was, for a brief period, in a mental frame where she could look at a world in a different manner. In fact, she has said herself, in one of her quotations, she has explained, or she has rather said, that she has looked at the world in 2 different ways. Her words are, and this is typical of someone who is suffering from a split personality, and also the fact that she was a very sensitive person and she experienced things in such a deep emotional manner. So she says, quotation, "It is as if my life were magically run by 2 electric currents, semicolon, joyous positive and despairing negative. Whichever is running at the moment dominates my life, comma, floods it." Quotation closed. So she makes it very clear, and it is very obvious from her words that her feelings or her emotions are very strong, very intense, and they dominate her mood completely. We have seen how Daddy, which of course was published posthumously because it was a part of the collection called Ariel, and which came out in 1965. These poems, which she had written in her personal moments, were written at a great pace in the winter of 1962 and the early month of 1963. She died in February of 1963. The Beekeeper's Daughter expresses a very dense and suggestive landscape, poetic landscape. The Beekeeper's Daughter is obviously herself, because she has always been very subjective in her expression. Even her novel The Bell Jar talks about her experiences and her trying to come to terms with her life or with her feelings or the emotions which she experiences, her loneliness at times, and generally a very disturbed mental state. Now, The Beekeeper's Daughter is in 3 stanzas. The first 2 stanzas are in 11 lines, though some lines are just 1 word each. The first stanza is rounded off by a sentence which is separate and which seems to come as a punchline, you can say. The second stanza is also rounded off with a sentence which sums up her feelings or what she has expressed in that stanza. The last stanza is of 10 lines, again rounded off by a statement. The craftsmanship of Sylvia Plath's poems is meticulous. She does not use disjointed sentences. The composition is flawless, and like I said in the earlier lecture also, there is a sense of contradiction between the content and the construction. But in The Beekeeper's Daughter, Sylvia Plath is in a different mood, and there is no trace of the existential angst or her anger or her frustration or her questioning or her dissatisfaction, which is the undercurrent, or which is the expression which is so powerfully present in the poem Daddy. The Beekeeper's Daughter, the first stanza, talks about the images and the scene in a garden in very dense and suggestive images. There is a lot of color. It is very visual. The entire scene is looked at from a child's eyes. It is a part of the poet's memories, and the presence of her father is there because the poem is titled The Beekeeper's Daughter, but it is a serene presence. It is a comforting presence. His presence seems to add to the perfection of the scene. It seems to complete the picture. A garden of mouthings, purple, scarlet, speckled black, the great corollas dilate, peeling back their silks. The physical texture of the images is almost visible. It seems that we can feel it. The flowers which are blooming and opening, they seem to be receptive to the sense of or the presence of a kind of fertility. There is a deep presence of or awareness of life, conception, and a kind of fruitfulness. The garden of mouthings, the colors purple, scarlet, black. Mouthings means obviously an opening, and the corollas, that is the sepals of the flowers hiding the core or the center, when they open up in the sun, inviting fertilization, they release the scent. The musk also again has a lot of physical and very sexual connotations. It encroaches, it seems to fill the air, circle after circle, a wall of scents almost too dense to breathe in. And there is an overpowering sense of fragrance, of flowers, of colors, of sensuality, of receptiveness, of an openness, of a readiness for fertilization, and an aura or an air of richness and the beginning of life, conception and fertility. Hieratical in your frock coat, maestro of the bees, you move among the many breasted hives. Here the master of the bees is a father. Hierarchical means that it seems that he is on some kind of an authoritative role. He is the master of the ceremonies. He is a figure of assurance, of confidence, of being totally in control, in command. And he is a beekeeper. That was one of the facts about her father, Otto Plath, that he was an academic with a very strong interest in beekeeping. And he goes around the garden, which is replete with scent and smell and the opening flowers, denseness of color and richness, and the humming of the bees, the very somnolent kind of atmosphere. And he moves with authority, with assurance, with confidence among the beehives, looking, checking on them, taking out the shells with beehives, the bees swarming around as he lifts the lid of the beehives. And the child, Sylvia, she looks on, mesmerized, fascinated, full of a deep love for her father, because this is one of those rare moments when she is at peace with herself and she is at peace with her father. It seems that her world is complete because of the presence of that loveliness, that overwhelming, that overpowering, that palpable, that presence of beauty, of life, of the loveliness and the perfection of the scene. My heart under your foot, sister of a stone. Her heart is still with happiness. It seems that the love which she feels for her father at this moment makes her feel overwhelmed. It is a love which completely fills her heart. Her heart is as still as a stone. It is overflowing. It needs nothing more. There is no pain. There is no yearning. There is no vacuum. There is no shadow. There is no emptiness. And in this beautiful garden, when the flowers are opening up to the sun, when there is an awareness of life, of richness, of fruitfulness, of a kind of beginning of the cycle of conception and birth, her father moving around the beehives, so impressive, so permanent. That is what she yearns for. He seems like he'll always be there, which does not happen. Later on, he dies and she is left with the sense of emptiness all her life, which she tries to combat. But now at that moment, and that perfect moment of her childhood, she is conscious of his presence, which is comforting, which gives her so much happiness that her heart is full. It is as still as a stone. The second stanza, trumpet throats open to the beaks of birds. The golden rain tree drips its powders down. In these little boudoirs, streaked with orange and red, the antlers nod their heads, potent as kings, to father dynasties. The air is rich. Here is a queenship no mother can contest. And she talks about, in this stanza, there is a sense of awe, there is a sense of wonder at how the bees, the queen bee, she is mother to an entire dynasty, because we know the queen bees are the image of fertility, because they give birth to the entire family of bees. They are meant for one purpose only, and that is to procreate, that is to bear, that is to bring forth an entire generation of bees. The beehive is made of small, tiny sections, and there is the central chamber, which is the queen's chamber, which the poet calls a boudoir. Boudoir is that chamber that it brings a sense of intimacy. It is where conception takes place. It is where the mating rituals take place. And the queen bee, she has the blessing, or she is gifted, or she has the power to bring forth dynasties. She is like the Mother Earth. No mother can contest. She is like something or a symbol of fertility. She has the strength and the gift and the boon, which is to give birth and be the center of the world of the bees, the center of the universe, bringing forth new generations in an endless cycle. And this stanza, again in 11 lines, it opens again with the image of color, richness, very pictorial, very vivid, of flowers and the beaks of the birds, which go deep down in the necks of the flowers, the trumpet flowers. Again, a very sensual image, almost visualizing the act of mating, of intercourse, of a physical contact, very powerfully, and the showering of the birds. There is an image of a surfeit of richness of life itself. The flowers open up, and the cycle of pollination as the birds insert their beaks deep into the necks of the flowers. The cycle of birth, of pollination, of the fertility, of nature's bounty, of the continuous possibilities of birth, of regeneration, of the beauty of life is present here. And the queen bee is the symbol of life itself. No mother can contest. She has the ability, or she has the gift. She is blessed to be the mother of countless generations. Her chamber is described as a boudoir, which is a word which means a cell or a place which is full of an act of intimacy, of conception, of a relationship of birth and regeneration. A fruit that's death to taste, dark flesh, dark parings. In burrows narrow as a finger, solitary bees keep house among the grasses, kneeling down. A fruit that is death to taste, dark flesh, dark parings. Here, this reference or this allusion is to the fact that when the queen bee mates, when there is a mating between a queen bee and a male bee, a drone, after the mating, after the insemination, when there is a conception, the male bee, the drone, is stripped of his masculinity. He leaves behind his masculinity, which is embedded in the queen bee. So it means an end for the male bee, and that is the reference here, a fruit that is death to taste, dark flesh, dark parings. So that is the fruit, but that is the death of the drone, the male bee. But that pairing is necessary because it brings forth life. And that relationship between a man and a woman, which ends in conception, is the secret of life itself. It is the foundation of life. And it may be dark, it may be something which, in the case of the bees, means an end, but still it is necessary, and the ecstasy of that moment is worth it. In burrows narrow as a finger, solitary bees keep house among the grasses. Kneeling down, I set my eyes to a whole mouth, and meet an eye round, green, disconsolate as a tear. Father, bridegroom, in this Easter egg, under the coronal of sugar roses, the queen bee marries the winter of your year. And then she, in the last stanza, which is of 10 lines, the author or the poet, she talks about her sense of awe and that experience which she had in that perfect moment, in that perfect world, full of fragrance and color and sound, and the presence of a father in the background as something which makes her world complete. She says, out as with a child's curiosity, she was lying on the ground and she saw a bee close as it flitted among the grass, and she seemed to stare into its eyes, large, unwinking, hard, bright, and she compares it to a teardrop. Father, bridegroom, in this Easter egg, under the coronal of sugar roses, the queen bee marries the winter of your youth. In this entire poem, there's a mixing of images and impressions and a languorous mood. Here, when in this last stanza, she says that father, bridegroom, all of them merge into each other, and it seems that coronal means a decoration of a kind of decoration. Easter eggs, the sugar roses, these point to something which is artificial. And she says the queen bee marries the winter of your year. That means the winter, which is the end and a totally different world from this present moment, this moment of summer, of spring, of color, of magic, of beauty, of fragrance, of movement, of the overwhelming of senses. This moment will remain etched in my memory, in her memory, the child's memory, and a lot of it has to do with that particular phase of her life when she is a wife and she is a mother. She is conscious of her ability to bring a new life into this world. That feeling of motherhood, that sense of that conception, that fertility, that idea of life, of regeneration is very, very clear. In the last stanza, she talks about bridegroom leading. Of course, the bridegroom has the reference to a wedding, and she says, or the poet says, the queen bee who is a symbol of life, a symbol of fertility, she marries the winter of a year. That is, this erases the fear of the winter of a year. That is the time when you will be old and you will no longer be able to procreate, reproduce, and it will be the end of whatever you are. Winter is synonymous with the end. But this life, this cycle of life, the queen bee, it is a symbol of the eternity of life, something which will continue forever, something which will not end. So we find that this poem, The Beekeeper's Daughter, is full of suggestiveness, sensuality, very sexual imagery, the underlying idea or the present idea of fertility, of conception, of intimacy, of very physical images of the sexual act almost we can say, and the feeling that this is, or life, or the process of life is something which is continual and something which is never ending. So like I said, this poem shows the poet in a totally different mood, which is a contrast to the mood which we have seen in Daddy. If we read both the poems together, it is very, very obvious. And in this poem, The Beekeeper's Daughter, the poet Sylvia Plath shows herself in one of her very rare and one of her very, very serene moods. And it is a beautiful poem. It is full of that richness of imagery, which almost reminds us of Keats. It has the same physical impact. It has the same sensual and pictorial quality. It has almost a hypnotic atmosphere and a consciousness and awareness of life, of conception as well. Now, we, as far as Sylvia Plath is concerned, she is, of course, one of the very well-known poems, one of the most notable poems of the postmodern English poetry of the modern era. The fact that she died at 30, and that also in a moment of despair, and she committed suicide, has also added to the aura about Sylvia Plath. Posthumously, her poetry collection Ariel came out. It was published in 1965. That was after her death. She died in 1963. The Colossus was her first work, and which came out in 1960 when in her own lifetime, which shows her early work, or it is a collection of her early poems. The time when she was alone in London, and just the months before her death, she wrote the poems which came out in Ariel, and Daddy is one of those poems. Many critics conjecture, or they have come to the opinion, that Ariel, that collection of the poems which was published in 1965, was viewed as a relic more than a book, because it was read in the light of Sylvia Plath's suicide. Sylvia Plath has been analyzed by the feminists also, and they have tried to see her struggles as a kind of betrayal by her husband. She is seen as someone who suffered because she was a woman. Her struggles were those which were not only struggles of a person, but more as a woman. She is seen as a victim of her husband's insensitivity towards her emotional problems and also her physical problems, because she was facing a very tough time in her life. Many critics brand her as a confessional poet. And these different views about her are still being studied, and they are still being analyzed. She got the Pulitzer Prize posthumously in 1982 for her collection of poems, which is known as the Collected Poems, which are edited by her husband, Ted Hughes, ex-husband, Ted Hughes, or the husband. They never got a divorce, but they were separated. It is true that Sylvia Plath was always self-destructive. She had attempted suicide once before also, and she had bipolar disorder, which is something very difficult to live with. Critics feel that there is almost a death wish. There's a consciousness of death in all her poems, particularly in the poems which she wrote in the winter of 1962 and the early January of 1963. A. Alvarez says, quotation, "Poetry and death are inseparable. Some of her poems, which are a part of Ariel, read almost as if they were written posthumously. There is a sense of a death wish." George Steiner says, or he has compared her poems in Ariel to Dylan Thomas, that great poet. And he says, George Steiner says, that no group of poems since Dylan Thomas's Deaths and Entrances has had as vivid and disturbing impact on English critics and readers as has Ariel. Deaths and Entrances by Dylan Thomas was published in 1946. So these are the different opinions about Sylvia Plath, viewed as a feminist, as a confessional poet, and of course the fact that she was self-destructive. She had this death wish. She struggled with bipolar disorder. She struggled with an existential angst. She struggled with her conflicting attitudes towards her father, which is expressed in Daddy, which ends on the wish or the feeling or the expression that she has put a stake through the heart of her memories. And finally, she has got rid of the torment. She has got rid of the demons in her mind, which had plagued her, which had troubled her ever since she was a small child, and ever since she had tried to understand who her father was, and left her, who died at such a young age, and left her with a feeling of an emotional vacuum and also a sense of abandonment. She was never on very cordial terms with either of her parents, even with her mother. But being a highly strung person, being a poet with such finely tuned sensibilities, suffering in her mind, we can see the traces of the very troubled person she was in her poem Daddy and other poems. But this particular poem, The Beekeeper's Daughter, shows her in a different mood. Perhaps it was because of that fact that she was, or she had recently experienced motherhood. She was at that stage in her life when she felt for a brief period physically fulfilled, because motherhood is a very emancipating feeling. She was conscious of her power as a woman to give birth. Ted Hughes and she had 2 children. And The Beekeeper's Daughter shows, again, a very perfectly constructed poem, shows no traces of the tension of her poem Daddy. It moves with a very slow and sensuous pace in a languorous mood, where the sensuality is overwhelming, the images are dense, they are very suggestive, very physical, and the ritual of fertilization, of conception, of the physical contact, of almost the sexual act, is very powerfully evoked in the images, in the first stanza and the second stanza, in the opening of the flower petals, of the receptiveness of the pollination, of the beaks being dipped in the long necks of the golden flowers, the trumpet-shaped flowers, the symbol of the queen bee as the image of fertility with her power to create generations, and an overwhelming consciousness of life and its unending cycle, which will erase the fear of winter, as the last line says. So, thank you. And Sylvia Plath is no doubt a poet who has a lasting impact on modern poetry, the postmodern English poetry. Thank you.